All right, hello everybody. Today I've got something for you that is a little late in coming out. The fact that I was unable to record for the last week and a half, not starting from last week, was a contributing factor. But also, I think it might have helped to let this situation kind of boil itself away to a certain degree. Because what I want to talk to you guys about is my, let's call it, pleasant surprise upon watching the Joe Rogan Jordan Peterson episode that came out recently that kind of ended up with a bunch of people fighting back and forth about various implications of what Peterson said in that episode that I think are partly justified, but partly I think maybe a little bit overblown. So I'll get into it a little bit. First off, the one thing I want to note is that, in a case where Jordan Peterson could have been very confrontational or could have, called Joe or, Dave Smith out on their behavior, these are the words that Jordan Peterson had for Joe when he was talking, when he mentioned that debate or that episode specifically. Quote, "I thought you guys did a very credible job, all three of you, of navigating unbelievably choppy waters," end quote. He also said, quote, "Do I think I could have done a better job than any of you? And I certainly didn't walk away from it with that idea in mind." Now, these two sentences, I think, help to show that Jordan Peterson wasn't attacking or didn't intend to attack Dave Smith or Joe Rogan for their positions on, Israel / whatever. And in fact, later on, Jordan Peterson made some statements, made some general criticisms that weren't directed at anyone, but were kind of like directed in general to, people who are making arguments or whatever. Quote, "What about the people who are feigning competence?" End quote. Quote, "One of the hallmarks of identification, they use false claims of victimization to manipulate." End quote. And then, and to me, there's other ones. Start without pride, in humility, desire to know more. You have a right to stumble over your own ignorance. How the hell do you know it's there before you reveal it? Elevating your status in the conversation as a consequence of abstract victory instead of increasing your wisdom and enhancing your reputation as a sojourner toward truth. If you admit to your ignorance and you ask genuine stupid questions, you will rapidly encounter people who are more than happy to share their wisdom with you. Things like that. And to me, he might say, well, that wasn't my intention. But to me, most of these criticisms that Peterson made sounded more like they were something that could be more easily directed at a Douglas Murray than a Dave Smith. The you don't know, you've never been, right? That's actually a lot closer to a criticism of Murray than a criticism of Smith. And so, I think that people fighting back and forth and saying that Peterson was kind of beclowning himself in the same way that Douglas Murray was beclowning himself, I think, are a little bit overblown. Now, I had read I made sure that I didn't watch anything about that episode before I had watched it in its entirety. And then, I couldn't avoid seeing some, video titles and a couple of random short comments. But all in all, I think that it was a fairly constructive conversation. Now, there's one other part of that conversation, or there's a few other parts of that conversation that kind of raise the ire of some people. Like, for instance, early on, and when I say early on, I mean 46-ish minutes in, Peterson tries to describe this 4 to 5% of people who are psychopaths, who are Machiavellian, sadistic, who go where power is, adopt the ideas, and put themselves on the forefront. He calls them Pharisees, people who proclaim themselves virtuous in order to give themselves power. It's worth noting that he outlines this, I guess, dark tetrad, right? Where people who are Machiavellian, narcissistic, psychopathic, and sadistic. And it's worth noting that in order to be one of the people that he's talking to, you have to exhibit all 4 of these traits. Now, there was a tweet that Peterson made, I think about a month previous to the Joe Rogan episode, where he called Candace Owens a Pharisee. But he didn't necessarily call her Machiavellian, sadistic, or psychopathic at all. In fact, I was kind of expecting, watching the episode, to hear him start calling people psychopaths and say, "Oh my goodness, how far he's fallen from the kind of person who is a psychiatrist or psychologist to a person who starts calling random people psychopathic without actually having, done treatment of them, right? But, to the best of my understanding, he didn't actually, in that episode, call out anybody specifically as psychopathic. Well, no, that's not true. That's not true, because he did kind of talk about, he mentioned Groypers by name, right? At least the organization. And I don't know that much about Groypers. One of the counter arguments I heard is that, well, Jordan Peterson was one of the guys who told people who became Groypers to, clean your room, make your bed, yada, 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 that'll make your life better. And I think it's worth noting that you can clean your room and make your bed and still make some really bad choices or come to abhorrent conclusions. I'm not saying necessarily that the conclusions of the Groypers are, abhorrent, but it seems clear that Jordan Peterson thinks so. And the fact that I have a made bed is not a defense from anything else I might do that someone else might find objectionable. Fair enough. I think there's also a bit of insulation that a lot of these people who are kind of at the forefront of this debate are kind of missing. It's one of those things where back in back in the first Trump term plus the COVID times after he left office were a time when social media was extremely censorious all over the place, and almost all in one direction, right? Even places that tried to show up to go in the opposite direction often found themselves, confounded by people taking away their web hosting and things like that. There's a bunch of alt tech sites, or Styx Hexenhammer calls them new tech sites because it's a nicer word, right? But there's a lot of these sites that exist that people who are on YouTube now and have gone back to YouTube now that YouTube has decided to be a little bit less censorious, or people who are mostly on Twitter or X, right? These people, generally speaking, are not seeing, I think, the things that you can see if you poke around on alt tech or new tech. BitChute and Odyssey or Minds are the three examples that I'm fairly in touch with, right? I still post my videos and stuff to Odyssey and BitChute because they're good places to hold stuff in favor of free speech, roughly speaking. And Twitter's good for that too, but Twitter doesn't have, playlists and stuff like that. Anyway, it's worth noting that these people do actually still exist, and while people like Dave Smith probably aren't encountering them that much anymore because they're not on these alt-tech sites, you can find some pretty vile and stupid things on these sites. And, I'd say probably 50% of these people are probably feds. 45% are, paranoid schizophrenics who are stuck in, a basement on a pension or something like that. And maybe 5% are people who might actually have some thought behind what they're trying to say. Incorrect thought, but thought nevertheless. These people do still exist, and the fact that the fact that some people, especially the biggest names in this thing, have kind of gone away from those alt-tech sites kind of, I think, insulates them from seeing some of that stuff and just how ridiculous it can be. So I think it's entirely possible that Peterson is talking about stuff like that, or even some of the really, relatively nasty stuff on Twitter, right? So that's one point. And I think that the reference to Candace Owens is a little bit overblown because it's neither timely nor complete, right? He called Candace Owens a Pharisee, but he didn't call her a psychopath or a Machiavellian or sadistic. And the sadistic part is the really important part, because most people who are in media are a little bit Machiavellian and maybe even a little bit psychopathic, right? So are CEOs. But there you go. But that doesn't make them sadistic necessarily. There was one other major point of that talk that got a lot of subsequent conversations going. And here we go. I'm going to quote Jordan Peterson here. Quote, "How do you know, given your radical increase in stature over the last 10 years, ellipsis, how do you know when your curiosity and even your skepticism about the fact that things aren't the way people say they are, because that's certainly been demonstrated in the last 10 years. How should you, ellipsis, how should anyone decide what guardrails to put up? Like, what do you look for? Do you have a conceptual system worked out for that?" End quote. And then just a minute later he says, quote, once you gain and reach an authority, then how do you take great care that the people you're talking to aren't, what would you say, eliciting or feeding a subculture, yeah, that's right, that hasn't got the proper aims. I think those ellipses were just pauses, and I put ellipses in there I don't think I'm missing any words, but anyway, what Peterson is talking about there is not, I think, like authoritative or authoritarian censorship of any particular person, but merely a question to someone like Joe of where do you draw the line between people who have legitimate beefs and people who are just kind of spouting gibberish, right? I mean, if Joe Rogan opened his podcast to flat earthers or chemtrailers, he would find an unlimited number of people willing to explain how they know that yada, yada, yada. And these things, geocentrism, birds aren't real, whatever, right? These things can be very slippery because all of the tests that prove them wrong are already known, and so counters to them can be thought up, exceptions, why it doesn't make sense to simply stand up, wait for a sunset and stand up, and then move a little bit to the west the next day and stand up at the same time and observe that these take the same amount of time. That's a pretty damning end to flat earthers, but it's more complicated. It takes longer to explain good ideas than it does to throw out shaky bad ideas. And I think there's value to that. It would be it'd be painful if a renowned science podcast spent all of its time talking about geocentrism and the reverse movements of Mars or whatever. Clearly, I mean, not clearly, but right. Like at this point, we're kind of pretty sure that the Earth revolves around the sun, and we have reasons for that aren't just, well, that's how things are set up. We understand that the sun has a lot more mass, and gravity is related to mass, and therefore the thing that has the most mass is closer to the center of rotation of any given two-body system. I could go on in a physicist kind of yada yada about that, but I don't really need to, I feel like. But and so I think and in the same way, Peterson might not want to talk to someone who, or like a doctor, wouldn't want to have people on his podcast who are talking about like the four humors over and over and over again and miasmas, right? It's like, no, we kind of understand how germ theory works at this point. And there are certainly holes in applications, but we can see these things with a microscope or whatever. Imagine someone who's like, oh, microscopes aren't real. Oh man, how long is it going to take me to debunk that one, right? Things like that. And I think that Peterson's concern in that sense is, I think, reasonable. He doesn't, and remember, earlier on he said, I can't imagine, do I think I could have done a better job than any of you? And I certainly didn't walk away from it with that idea in mind. That's that quote again earlier, right? So clearly, Peterson is not talking about having on experts, but he's talking about drawing a line between how much you're going to entertain things that pretty much everybody is just sure aren't correct. And the funny thing about that, right, is that I mentioned earlier that in a normal, open like debate situation over some proposition A versus not A, right? Over time you're going to see the experts kind of go from half and half to leaning in one direction, and of course governments and things like that can certainly influence that, and there's always going to be a certain number of cranks on the wrong side. But seeing all of these people say, you know what, I looked at the data and I'm an expert and I concluded this is probably the right side, and seeing most of the people moving off in that direction and very few people moving in the other direction is evidence that is at least possibly evidence that one side has got the point and the other side might not have. But again, there's always going to be cranks who are going to be on the even if we factually knew for sure, right, that everyone when they were born heard a voice in their head that said not A is false and A is true, right? There would still be some people who are like, I don't trust that voice, right? But anyway, I don't know. I guess my takeaway from that episode was that I was kind of pleasantly surprised, because I was worried that it was going to go as poorly as the Smith-Murray debate, which Again, I already did a video on that. You can look at that, and maybe I'll put a link in the description or something. I don't know. But like in that case, that was, and I saw this as a video title, and I think it's probably the best word for it. Murray beclowned himself in that debate, whereas Peterson did not beclown himself talking to Joe Rogan about that topic. I think he was fairly even-handed. I think that he might dislike Candace Owens and Groypers. He might think he has a very good reason to do that. Joe wasn't there to offer a particularly detailed defense of either of those people, especially since Candace Owens didn't actually get mentioned in the episode. This is something that people who kind of went digging through Peterson's Twitter history. It was like, oh, he called Candace Owens a Pharisee last month. Well, he didn't call her psychopathic, Machiavellian, or sadistic. So, even if he thinks she is a Pharisee, she might not be the kind of person that he's talking about when he talks about these psychopaths using these ideas as false weapons to advance themselves. Again, it's one of these things where people who left alt tech or new tech when YouTube and Twitter became more free speech platforms in 2022 or so, people who've left all those alt tech platforms are no longer exposed to some of the bizarre things that you will see on those less beloved platforms. And I think that insulation. Well, I mean, it's possible that Peterson is also insulated, in which case he might be talking out of his ass. But as someone who still maintains contact with those platforms, it is pretty clear that there is a significant group of people who, have these bizarre ideas, and they'll argue all day, all night, all day, all night, because they have nothing better to do about it, than try to prop up their own pet ridiculous idea. There is one more thing that I wanted to mention just quickly. Not prepared to have a full argument here about the deep ideas behind this, but there was one point that Peterson made when it was sometime after 46 minutes in. I don't have the exact timestamp, but at some point they're talking about the anti-Semitic side of this, pseudo right-wing power grabbing movement that Peterson is afraid of. And Peterson says, quote, "There's nothing more annoying than a successful minority." Now, if I, as Peterson, wanted to defend or to defend Jewish people or to oppose anti-Semitism, however you want to describe that, I would be wary of making arguments that weak in favor of my point, right? Because there are plenty of successful minorities, right? Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, Indian Americans. I think even like Nigerian Americans make more money on average than white Americans. Again, I haven't checked that, but I'm pretty sure that like white Americans are not like the most successful group, and there's more than just one successful minority above them. But my point is that if you're trying to argue against a thing, you need to give the best possible arguments, as opposed to making weak ones which are easily toppled by your opponents, leaving you effectively with nothing. Again, it was only a minor part of that conversation at that point, and Joe didn't really dig into it any more than that. But it is a very flimsy argument for why Group A receives a lot more negative attention compared to groups B, C, D, E, and F. And so, one of the things I would say is that if you're going to make an argument, make sure if you're going to make an argument against some, even if you think it's irrational, right? Even if you think there's some kind of irrational group that hates Group A for no really good reason, if you're going to make arguments against hating Group A, you better make them good ones. Otherwise, the irrational people will jump on your flimsy argument and say, well, this is not why, and yada, yada, yada. And Peterson they won't even say this is not why, right? They'll just say Peterson is wrong, and then they'll leave you to assume that Peterson is wrong about a bunch of other things at the same time. So that was the one minor point I wanted to make about that. So anyway, that's all I've got for you for today. I'm not really sure what I'm going to title this. I was originally thinking of titling it like Pleasantly Surprised by the Peterson interview or something like that. Maybe I'll try to think of something a little bit more catchy. But anyway, that's what I've got. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I've got another plan for another video. Sargon of Akkad did a video called the woke right discourse is over. And it's mostly a video about things that aren't really important, but there's one point in it that he gets to that I think he might be making a pretty significant mistake and not realizing it. So I think that's going to be my next video, and maybe I'll get to that tomorrow or something like that. Anyway, have a good week. Rest of your week. It's Thursday. Have a good rest of your week and have a good weekend, and I'll see you next time.